Oh, hello there. I didn't see you. Today we're going to be discussing vampires in literature. A literary vampire usually has the following characteristics.
Old. Vampires are usually mature, even old, and entice their victims in order to feed off of them. Mysteriousness. Literary vampires usually have a sense of allure that cannot be traced easily. Vampires also have unknown origins, acting on unknown motives, and carefully keeping their past a secret from both the reader and other characters. Victims. Literary vampires, like their mythological counterparts, require victims to feed upon. Whereas literal vampires feed on the blood of their victims, literary vampires can metaphorically feed upon a character's person, life force, or any other symbol of life and sustenance. Choice of victims. Vampires tend to seek out victims that are young women, especially young women who may be emotionally, physically, or otherwise vulnerable. For the majority of literary history, women were thought of as submissive, almost docile creatures, and such a stereotype contributed to the specific selection of victims amongst vampires. Victims that the vampire feeds upon tend to follow in his or her tormentor's footsteps, becoming likewise vampires in some cases and absorbing specific characteristics of the vampire in others. A literary victim of a vampire would adopt such characteristics as aggression, victimization, and a disregard for rules and society.
Now, vampires in literature are usually used for the purpose of
Literary vampires often exhibit an utter lack of empathy. They simply do not understand or respect the feelings of others. It is this precise trait that causes them to act on the impulse to constantly exploit the lives of those around them for their own personal gain. Furthermore, vampires do not respect other people's rights and see themselves as superior human beings. These qualities of arrogance, selfishness, and exploitation mar human nature, and for this reason, writers incorporate vampires in their novels, in order to show readers this dark side of human nature. Another reason an author includes a literary vampire in his or her work is in order to facilitate a dark, mournful tone throughout the entire novel, which can serve to set the mood for the entire plot. The author creates this haunting feeling of raw Darwinian exploitation, a feeling that can have profound metaphorical effects on the reader. So long as selfish people exist, so too will literary vampires.
Vampires are everywhere in literature. Why, just the other day, I observed an example of a literary vampire. Here we can see a vampire walking past a young woman, the ideal victim. Watch how easily she succumbs to his dark charm.
Well, hello there.
Oh, hi.
Wow, what a literary dog.
Vampires in literature usually implies a sexual connotation. This is exceptionally apparent in literature of the 19th century, the Victorian era. During the Victorian era, which lasted from 1837 to 1901, values of social and sexual restraint were promoted. Due to this restraint, authors resorted to using vampires to talk about sex in literature, and other creatures to talk about other taboo subjects.
Here we have a prime example of literary vampirism connoting sexual messages. Notice the clasped hands and female enthusiasm as the vampire leads the young woman, the ideal victim, to her fate. Although the vampire is enthusiastic at first, as he absorbs his victim's youth, energy, and virtue, it slowly fades away to indifference. As the vampire grows stronger, his victim grows weaker and weaker as she loses her life force.
Oh my gosh, you'll never guess what I did today.
I don't care. I've got better stuff to do.
Why don't you have time for me anymore? I feel so tired and sleepy.
I have other stuff to do. I feel great.
Eventually, the vampire's victim begins to die, as the vampire sucks out all of her vitality and life force. Now that we've seen what a literary vampire looks like, let's take a look at some common examples in literature. In the classic Gothic novel Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte uses symbolic vampirism to convey a dark tone in the novel, create a plot circulating around the idea of revenge, and show the dark side of human nature. Heathcliff, one of the main characters in the novel, symbolically feeds on other characters. Every person he comes into contact with, even his lover, Catherine, diverts from a path of happiness to one of despair. Once Heathcliff no longer has anyone to feed upon anymore, because all of his victims are either dead or beyond his grasp, Heathcliff very fittingly starves to death, literally and metaphorically. Another example of a symbolic vampire can be found in a more recent and less literary medium, the TV show Ben 10. There exists a character known as Michael Morningstar in the show, and Morningstar literally absorbs the life force of young girls at his high school in order to give himself raw energy and to maintain his youth, at the expense of the young girls who are instantly met with old age and a complete lack of strength. This character very clearly is an example of a vampire because he feeds on young, vulnerable girls in order to keep himself young and give himself vitality, and he often irrevocably damages his victims in the process. Furthermore, his victims follow him everywhere he goes so that they can aid him in his endeavors, an example of how a metaphorical vampire's victims may adopt some characteristics of the culpable vampire. In conclusion, vampires' literature can be identified as being old, having mysterious qualities that attract others to them, and targeting young women in order to feed off their vitalities. As the victim's youth and energy are being sucked away, she becomes more and more like the vampire. Authors use vampires in order to represent the dark side of human nature and to haunt the reader. When a vampire is spotted in literature, he or she is usually there in order to convey a metaphorical and symbolic value, particularly a sexual connotation. The very essence of a vampire in literature can be summed up to the ruthless exploitation of the people around the vampire.